France Space Learning Interwar Years 1918 to 1939. Political developments. The Treaty of Versailles, Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France. The Saar coalfields were handed over for 15 years. The Rhineland was demilitarized. France were given mandates in Syria, Lebanon, Cameroon and Togo. Clemenceau was rejected as a candidate for the presidency by the Bloc National in 1920. He retired soon after. The legislative was called the National Assembly. It was made up of two parts. Firstly, the Chamber of Deputies, with around 616 members, votes every 4 years, plus an indirectly elected Senate. The executive was the president, who served 7-year terms. The Communist Party split from the Socialist Party in 1920. Leon Blum was the leader of the Socialist Party, known as SFIO. The Radical Party was a centre-left party. The Bloc National was a right-wing coalition. They won the 1919 elections with 450 seats, which included the Radical Party. Briand was forced to resign for being soft on Germany. Poincaré invaded the Ruhr in 1923. However, economic problems caused him to resign. In the 1924 elections, the Cartel de Gauche won. Heriot was the Prime Minister. The government fell, however, in 1925. They were obstructed by a wall of money. Poincaré then became Prime Minister from 1926 to 1929. The National Bloc narrowly won the 1928 elections. The Communists only won 11 seats. The Socialists won 107 seats. Briand was the Foreign Minister till 1932. He followed a policy of rapprochement. Foreign policy successes were the Dawes Plan 1924, Locarno Spring 1925, Kellogg-Briand Pact 1928, and the Young Plan 1929. The Maginot Line began to be built in 1929. The Lausanne Conference in 1932 recognized Germany's right to rearm. The Franco-Soviet alliance was signed in 1935. Jones said that political extremism grew in the 1930s due to the Depression, political corruption, and international tension. Gay and Webb said the improved economy in the 1920s just plastered over the deep divisions in French society. 1929 to 1932, André Tardeur headed 3 governments. The Cartel de Gauche won the 1932 elections. During the Stavisky affair 1934, it led to accusations of government corruption. Daladier became the new Prime Minister again the same year. Action Française, Croix de Feu, 300,000 members, and the Jeunesse Patriotes, who wore fascist-style uniforms. These 3 groups, on the 6th of February 1934, tried to overthrow the government, leading to 17 dead and 2,000 wounded. The left wing say that it was a right-wing attempted coup d'etat. Jones says it was a spontaneous protest. Daladier resigned. The centre-right government under Demerge, who led a national unity government. 1934, Stalin pressured communists to start a popular front of leftist parties. In 1935, Comintern told communist parties to work with all anti-fascists. 1935, leftists made gains in local elections. The communist CGTU rejoined the socialist CGT. Within 2 years, it had grown to 4 million members. The Popular Front, Le Front Populaire, formed in June 1935. The Popular Front won a majority in the 1936 elections. Communists going from 10 to 72 seats, and the Socialist Party under Leon Blum's leadership, the biggest party with 147 seats. Mackay shows the polarization. Said that he shows the polarization in French politics. Paxton, he says that there was no real change, just the electoral system favoured the most united coalition. Blum was hated by the right for being a Jew, a socialist, leader of a leftist government, and for being an intellectual. The Matignon agreements made them popular with the workers and the lower middle class. Government came to power 3 months after the militarization of the Rhineland. Blum followed non-intervention in the Spanish Civil War. He wanted to get involved, but Britain and the Conservatives pressured him. This lost him support on the left. Blum was forced to resign in June 1937. He returned, but he only lasted a month. During that month, he sent supplies to Republicans in Spain. The Croix de Feu became a political party called Parti Social Français, with 1 million members. The Popular Front fell in September 1938 after the Munich conference. Daladier's signature angrily condemned by the communists. Jackson said the Popular Front provided huge excitement but was a disappointing failure. Finlay said Blum's efforts to conciliate all groups in French society ended up satisfying none. Price, the hopes aroused on the left caused genuine fear in the right. The French right used to say, better Hitler than Blum. Economic developments. 30 billion war debt to the USA and the UK. 13 billion was owed to France by Russia, but because of the Bolshevik Revolution, this was not going to be paid back. The franc halved by 1919. By 1920, it was only 20% of its pre-war value. 1 million buildings were destroyed in World War I. 1 million sheep were killed, 1 million cattle, 500,000 horses. 1939, 6 billion francs were in circulation. By 1920, this had gone up to 38 billion. During the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was to pay reparations. 8,000 factories rebuilt were the same as before the war. 1924, industrial production reached 1914 levels. André Citroën adopted the assembly line, and soon Citroën, Renault and Peugeot were major suppliers of cars. By 1929, France led the world in vehicle production with an annual output of 250,000 cars. In 1925, 95% of farmland destroyed in the war was under cultivation again. Food production reached pre-war levels by 1929. There was a scissor effect in the 1920s of rising industrial prices and falling agricultural prices. 1.5 million immigrant workers. They came from countries such as Poland and Italy. Workers had an 8-hour working day in 1919, yet their wages were a fifth lower. Improved in the 1920s, but returned to pre-war levels by 1929. The franc declined to 1/10 of its pre-war value. Paxton said conservative hostility to Heriot, who was the Prime Minister, contributed to the run on the franc. The left blamed the 200 families who controlled the Bank of France. Poincaré returned France to the gold standard. Napoleonic franc was replaced with the Poincaré franc, valued at 1/5 of its pre-war value. Food production reached pre-war levels by 1929. By 1929, industrial production was up by 40% and foreign trade up by 66% on pre-war values. Government expenses went up in this period by 20 billion francs, but state revenue went up by 50 billion. About 1/3 of the government's 1929 budget was allocated to defence. During the Depression, Paxton says it was slow, demoralising rot rather than a major upheaval. In 1931, 40,000 jobs were lost a month in the first 6 months. 1932, there were still only 250,000 unemployed, but this was because 1 million foreign workers had returned home. 1930s, farmers' debts had risen to 10 billion francs. The conference in Lausanne in 1932 acknowledged Germany's inability to pay reparations. Good harvest from 1932 to 1935 actually made things worse for farmers. Prices dropped by 34% for vegetables, 40% for meat, and 60% for wine. Industrial production did not reach 1929 levels until 1939. France's share of international trade dropped by 44% in volume and 82% in value. The Matignon agreements, wages were increased by 10%. Farmers also had their grain prices increased. Nationalisation. The government took control of the railways, armaments, and the Bank of France. France was producing fewer cars in 1937 than in 1929. September 1936, France finally left the gold standard. January 1937, Blum announced a slowing down of the social programme because of the economic problems. October 1937, it finally devalued the franc, but it was too late. Paul Renaud became finance minister in 1938 and suspended many Popular Front economic reforms. Social developments. 1.3 million dead in the First World War. This is 17%, more than any other nation. 3 million wounded or traumatized, 1 million permanently disabled. The population in 1914 was 39.5 million. In 1919, it had gone down to 39 million, despite including Alsace-Lorraine. 63% of the 1914 class of Saint-Cyr Military Academy were dead. 25% of all men between 18 and 27 were killed. 200,000 civilians were killed. 166,000 deaths due to the Spanish flu in 1919. An example of the population loss is Aisne, who lost 2/3 of their population. 1935 onwards, deaths outnumbered births. 42% of adult women were still in employment, 40% of the total workforce in the 1920s. 1920, banned sale of contraceptives, laws against abortionists, support of the celebration of Mother's Day, and introduction of state medals for fertility. Bills to give women the vote were rejected by the National Assembly in 1919, 1929, 1932 and 1935. 1936, 3 women were appointed to serve in the Popular Front government. 1938, women were made legal majors for the first time. 1 million immigrants in France before the war. By the mid-1930s, they numbered 2.5 million, nearly 10% of the adult population. Jones said that France was Europe's melting pot. In society, 1/3 were peasant farmers, 1/3 were workers, and 1/3 were middle class. Wealth and power was concentrated in the grande bourgeoisie, which is the upper middle class. Price says French society dreamt less of revolution than of social promotion. 1920s were referred to as les années folles, the crazy years. The Dada movement spread to Paris. It was a rejection of modern ways of thinking. Surrealism developed out of the Dada movement. It was founded by André Breton. Writers and artists from abroad were attracted to Paris in the 1920s. Examples of this are Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Gertrude Stein, and James Joyce. In 1925, the Exposition of the Directory of Arts launched Art Deco. 1920s, there was a jazz culture in Paris. African-American dancer Josephine Baker became a national star. Charles Lindbergh became a popular hero. First solo transatlantic flight in 1927, landing his plane at Le Bourget airport near Paris. 250 million cinema tickets sold in 1933. Jones says the major politicians were an increasingly age set with their roots in the Belle Epoque rather than the Jazz Age. Government carried out anti-clerical policies such as reducing ties with the Vatican and lessening church influence in public schools in Alsace and Lorraine. By the 1920s, anti-clericalism had become irrelevant to many French people. 1930s, diplomatic relations with the Vatican. Government's policies on contraception and abortion found favour with church teachings. The church was critical of materialist and consumerist popular culture. There was a decline in church attendance. Marie Claire was a magazine founded in 1937. L'Auto sold 500,000 copies a day during the Tour de France in 1923. 1936, workers went on strike. Paxton says the strikes were more about celebrating Blum's victory and venting off steam after years of worsening conditions. The Matignon Agreements, June 1936. 40-hour working week and 2 weeks paid holiday. School leaving age was increased from 13 to 14. Paul Reynaud made modifications from 1938 to the 40-hour week. Working class people could go on holiday for the first time, shocking middle class people. Now have a 10-minute break.